Yes, recording is progress. There is a recognition that it's about communities. It's not just about the physicality of places, of building, or of spaces. And the communities that live and work and interact with those historic towns, centers, urban fabrics, they are as important as anything else, basically. So the museum approach basically is not accepted anymore. So when something happens, when some earthquake, landslide, or something happens, usually what we see, a flood of international attention to monuments, as we saw in the BAM case, for example, or in many other cases, that international organizations join forces with national organizations and to do something about the well-recognized and those very famous monuments. And it's very natural and it's very normal, but it is not enough. So what I've seen in the many works that I've seen, so these are my observations, that we can identify categories or layers of, of the built heritage that are being dealt with after something happens in post-disaster situation. And maybe we can say even that, even in normal situation. So the first level or the first category is monuments. Those well-known, famous citadels. For example, the first one in this, if I can show it, yeah. The first one is the citadel in Herat, which basically is being restored by Aga Khan Foundation. And I'm happy that Solmaz Jan, you have invited Dr. Bustani to talk about Herat, and I'm sure he will share many things in this regard. And there are also special interest properties, for example, bazaars. This is the entry to the bazaar, the souk, actually, in Aleppo. So those kind of iconic properties which are related to the identity and the fame of a city also, of, even if they are not listed, they are also of interest. So perhaps international organizations come in. And of course, we have urban amenities. And then we have these small scale buildings, which, which they shape the mass of the urban fabric, houses, shops, private properties. And as I think it's very understandable to see that, okay, the level of complexities of dealing with this, with each level of these built heritages are different. They are in nature are different. For example, and because of that, they all are complex, but the nature of complexities are a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, different. For example, when we are talking about monuments, when we are talking about those very well-known iconic buildings or sites, we are dealing with clients, hopefully informed clients. We are dealing with expert-based or expert-driven decisions. And the number of those actually is less. So the characteristics are kind of more projects. Even it's a very big, complex project, but it's a project. But when we go down towards the mass of the urban fabric and the houses, shops, the numbers actually increases a lot, and it might not be a project anymore, because in a good number of individual cases, they need to work together to achieve something in total. And so they may represent something like programs, not a single project. They may be a number of smaller scale projects tied together to create to achieve something. So the level of the complexities, the stakeholders who are active in these levels are different. And the recognition that, look, at which level I'm working in, and at which level we want to do something, I think this is the first step to think about dealing with urban heritage and cultural heritage. I want to bring your attention to a couple of examples from restoring monuments and iconic properties, and how the decisions decisions for restoring those is related with the complexities that they represent. Let's see. This is the Mosque of Aleppo, the Grand Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo, which is being restored by the government, is managed by the government. And the minaret of the mosque, which is around, I think, 950 years old, it collapsed. So the approach was that, look, we collect and we clean all stones that remained from the minaret, we number them, and we rebuild the minaret again. So it's a governmental-based decision. It's a top-down decision, and actually it's a monument. So local people, how can they rebuild it, basically? And so this approach, which is restoring monuments, is at that level, and it can have other approaches. For example, rebuilding the minaret with new materials again. So that decision to keep those stones, actually, it's related to build it the way it was, which I will talk about it later. But so this is one project, yes. But if we go towards the iconic buildings, for example, the bazaar in Aleppo, which I showed you before, it's a bazaar is created, from a collection of shops. Is one entity, but this one entity is like a system, is produced by a number of subsystems, a number of small buildings. So for restoring this kind of iconic building, we see that in here we are dealing with ownership, we are dealing with people, we are dealing with maybe one owner passed away. Maybe one owner is not there. So the issue of inheritance. So the level of monuments, iconic buildings, and urban fabric, whenever we have people, either in the form of ownership or participation, we can see that it increases the level of complexities very much. And for example, in this case, for Syria, the idea for rebuilding or restoring bazaars first was that each owner has to basically rebuild the interior of their work. But it was, how can you trace people? How can you force people, actually, even if we can use the word force, how can we force people to start the reconstruction and restoration of their shops? So it presented a very good level of actually challenges and problems. But there has been some pilot cases that, for example, this photo shows that I think Al-Sagatiyat Souk has been, as a pilot project, has been managed and funded by Aga Khan Foundation and was treated as a big project again. So not dealing with individual ownership, is not bringing those into the equation. So working on that to deal with the challenges of those collaborative basically operations. And of course, those monuments, iconic buildings, they are the first ones that are going for the restoration and reconstruction. Why? Because there's a symbolic meaning, because cultural heritage is tied with our own identity, and cultural heritage has the capacity for healing from trauma and triggers pride in ourselves. That's why when a conflict happens, a war happens, usually cultural heritage sites are also a target for destruction, because their destruction disheartens the local community and it weakens the local community. So they are usually, this kind of iconic properties usually are going for the restoration and reconstruction. And the same happened in BAM. The same happened in BAM. Instead of an international organization, the National Reconstruction Management took the responsibility of rebuilding Bazaar from scratch, and because they noticed that there is a challenge of collaborative operations, how you find people, how you find people at the same time to make them create something collectively. And I clearly remember in the BAM case that the reconstruction manager told me that, look, it might not be a masterpiece of architecture, what we did for the Bazaar of BAM, but what we did was a very good example of managerial work. So to not get trapped in the issues that could delay the reconstruction of Bazaar. And why it is important? Because these are a symbol, not only an emotional or spiritual symbol, but also a functional element and center of urban life, of thinking that, look, I'm living in that city. So these are important elements that decision makers recognize that, okay, instead of waiting for this to happen at some time and dealing with those challenges, we do it ourselves. Monuments and iconic buildings, they are kind of, at some point, even for bazaars, we saw in the case of Al-Sagatiyat Souk and the BAM Bazaar, one organization can take control and can work on that as a big project. But the mass urban fabric, that creates our cities. What I've seen in so many, Marvin, you mentioned the book Historic Cities in the Face of Disasters. Yes, from that book and from the previous book and other works that I've either my own research or I worked with other researchers, I've seen that throughout history, actually mostly from post-war World War II, there are questions and dilemmas repeating themselves in different cases of reconstruction, and I wanted to share. So for those urban fabric, whatever we are doing, we need to think about these questions and these dilemmas, and hopefully we can think about them in advance instead of waiting for a disaster to happen. So, for example, and see the bigger picture of our cities. one of the main questions and dilemmas is that when a historic city has been damaged or has been destructed, shall we rebuild it exactly the same it was before? Or shall we see it as an opportunity to think about modernization of the city, to think about redevelopment of the city? And it's kind of started, it's very much linked with the philosophical and theoretical advancement, after that time. But for example, in the case of Coventry, after the World War II, many of European cities went for the approach where it was, how it was, basically rebuilding whatever it was before the destruction. But the Coventry city in UK took a kind of different approach. It was an industrial city, but it had a very medieval center and urban identity. So they organized a competition. And in that competition, the winner was that the one we build a new, basically, the winner was to modernize the city. And it was represented on the restoration of the main cathedral, which only the shell, one part of the shell had stayed. So instead of rebuilding or reconstructing the rest of the cathedral the way it was, how it was, a new development, and the remainder of the cathedral remained. And this approach repeated itself basically throughout the city. So the city became a mixture of modern, and when I say modern, I really mean modernism architecture, the modernism architecture, and the remainder of the medieval cities wherever it remained after the destruction. And but as time passed, basically the city became the subject of lots of discussions and lots of criticisms. Some admire and praise the city's approach to take this opportunity to go for a completely different, basically, way of shaping the city. And some other people say that was a disaster itself. So the destruction that this approach made to the city was more than the destruction of the war itself. So there has been lots of actually controversy against this approach. The dilemma repeats itself. This is something that basically from the beginning we need to think about. The dilemma, the bigger picture. In 2009, L'Aquila, again a historic city, small town in Italy, massive earthquake, and the city center damaged a lot. So the approach, not like Coventry, not modernization, not exactly where it was, how it was. And so the idea to keep the integrity of the old historic center. But what it did actually, first of all, it became a very, very lengthy reconstruction and restoration period operation. Now is 2021, and the reconstruction still continues. And if you go to L'Aquila even now, you can see that in the city center, it's like a very big construction site. Actually, some people say that it's the biggest construction site in Europe. It became very expensive. It became very expensive. And what it did, because of the very lengthy operation that vacuumed the life out of the heart of the city. So basically, around the cities, in the suburbs, the city went towards the suburbs. So 12 years is a generation. And so the future challenge for L'Aquila is that how to bring back the urban life that was once there in the city center. And the point is that from one side, the Coventry example, from the L'Aquila example, you know, two extremes, basically, two extremes. There are other extremes. In Beirut, the post-war reconstruction of Beirut, very interestingly, it shows another extreme, which the government created a company, a private sector company. The government created Solidaire, I think if you Google it, it is there, is operative. And so the Solidaire company became responsible for the reconstruction of that part of the, I think whole the city, but I'm working, I've seen this part of the city. So very top down, and reconstruction became kind of excuse, some kind of opportunity to completely change the city center. Instead of souk, so we are having luxurious shopping mall, and instead of release lands for doing all the developments in that area, the scheme of compulsory purchases has been introduced. So basically leading to the displacement of people and basically gentrification. So if in the historic city, Bazaar was a place to interact was a place of interaction between different social and economical groups, a kind of like Bazaar in Tehran, different social group can communicate, and a common ground for social cohesion. This approach, this extreme approach in Beirut, created a segregation. So it not only took that cohesion out of the urban life, but it created a further segregation. In Benghazi, in Libya, you know, I hope that this talk, my sharing these, is not to provide answer, is to create more questions, basically, and towards how we think about the bigger picture and how can we interpret the bigger picture into the operation. So in Benghazi, some local communities, with help of some NGOs, cleared some urban spaces. But so everyone, you know, acknowledged that yes, the cultural, the built heritage is very important, and local community with the help of NGO cleared some urban spaces. But at some point, they came to the understanding that, look, we don't have capacity. We don't have a capacity, and so what was, so this is a research done by Neda Al-Beiruti. I can read now, but Neda, and she interviewed a good number of local community and those NGOs. and those and many of them even were saying that, look, we don't have capacity. There is no shared vision. When it's top is bottom up, there is no shared vision of what to exactly, what to do, what to remain, how it should be. And we wish, even some say that we wish a private sector company like Soladier in Beirut to come, take control, and do everything for us. So this is another actually case that I've came across with. So when we are, so you see, what to remain, what to renew, what to rebuild, what to keep it as it is for whatever expense and whatever time it is, and the question, what is the reference point? Where is it? Is it exactly before the disaster, or at another time of point, another point of time? And again, there are researchers that in some countries to rebuild the national, a strong national identity, even for the international view, they ignore some part of history, and they use the reference point as a time that it fits the agenda. And again, the question of scale. A monument is maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Iconic buildings, iconic properties like bazaars, how many of them? But the challenge of urban fabric, that is about the managing the scale of interpreting all those decisions into the scale of a city. And again, heritage for who and for whom, by who, for who. The case of L'Aquila is heritage for who? It's for people who are living out of basically, who are being disconnected to that heritage for 12 years. And so there are a good number of questions, and I hope the examples showed that whatever decision that at whatever level we are having, it's also related to, or it will be influencing the urban development vision that we are having for that city. And if we, we are having this dilemma, so heritage and city and everything, but of course it's a post-disaster, and the disaster management, as Marvin mentioned, disaster management is another big field of operations and expectations and principles. And one of those is people's participation. And in such a complex, a major recommendation is that people need to participate, because it's about psychological recovery, because it's about recreating bonds with their homes, with their built environment, and of course, for sharing responsibility and accountability with people. So when we are dealing with the scale of urban fabric, cultural heritage, and everything, again, the big dilemma, you know, they very much too many expectations that we are having from that operation. You know, another dilemma that comes in to the equation is it, you know, the disaster management studies, the post-disaster reconstruction, you know, experiences all say that, okay, participatory process, participatory reconstruction. So one dilemma again is, shall it be participatory? Shall people be participating or not? But from it in theory is very good. In theory is very good, but in practice, when we bring people to the equation as to become part of the machinery of implementing something, and also for decision making that hopefully is not just implementing, but also for creating a shared vision, we are adding a very big layer of complexity to everything that is already complex. Why? Because local people, participating local people, within the system of operations, they are just one element. Already, I was bringing a number of actually stakeholder, international organizations, fund, construction or reconstruction management, urban stakeholders, and in that, when we add participating local people, we add a big system element in that equation. And I hope it's kind of clear that when we add people to the equation, we make the whole operations more kind of a program, development programs, instead of small, instead of very well defined projects. And so the question again, the dilemma, again, I want to go back to the case of L'Aquila. The case of L'Aquila actually is not a participatory, is not a participatory reconstruction at all. So basically, heritage conservation became an excuse to exclude people. And the question, to what expense, so at the end, after 15 years, for example, how long it takes, it will be a very beautiful museum style city center, but to what expense? And there are lots of actually criticism from the local community. For example, a young architect was telling me that, look, as the young generation of professionals in this city, we don't have, so this younger generation, we don't have the opportunity to mark our own mark on the city. So basically the opportunity for this generation of architects, of urban designers, has been taken from them. And everyone basically, if you go to L'Aquila, everyone is very angry about the whole situation. It became very expensive, but of course, it will be very beautiful. The dilemma. Again, I go back to BAM again. These two are examples of the architectural design ideas. I've taken these photos from the exhibition in 2005, actually, that consultancy companies were sharing their ideas for rebuilding houses in BAM. And reconstruction was participatory, so each person should reconstruct their own house, having some technical and some finance and administrative supports from the management. And these are basically the kind of typical houses that we see in the BAM case. And there are lots of, it's a huge gap between what it was envisioned from the beginning and what it was actually built at the end. And of course, there are lots of, I think Marvin also had a research on that. There are lots of researches on this and why it happened, which basically links to the complexities and the when you bring people everything changes basically. And well, hopefully I can talk about that. So with having the idea of heritage conservation, with having the idea of restoring, maintaining the heritage, the identity, the one that we all share and we all hopefully appreciate. So the first thing is that we need to recognize that heritage is not just monument. You know, yes, organizations comes, government works on a number of iconic, symbolic monuments, things, but what about the rest? What about the rest? And post-disaster reconstruction operations, whatever, you know, successful or unsuccessful, as well as examples of participatory development experiences in a certain context, they provide very good learning opportunities to deal with the urban heritage at those complex situations. And in my belief, is not only those complex situations, but even in normal situation, because what post-disaster situation, whatever activities we are, or whatever operation for safeguarding heritage we have done, if it's successful or not, or what, it always opens up the problem. It shows the problem, and also shows spaces for improvement, shows where in the existing system there is an opportunity, there's space to make a little bit, even a little bit improvement. And hopefully we can have that improvement in a normal situation. And so all lessons are very much, or previous lessons are very much helpful. And another one, cities, you know, the recognition that cities already, even in normal situation, are very complex. The decision that it might not look like a tangible decision, for example, the allocation of funding, it does have tangible consequences. For example, the decision in Lacula for funding for each restoration, for each building, the decision on funding was that each building can have whatever fund needed to restore it properly. So, but for example, if we compare it with BAM, the decision on funding in BAM was that all buildings will have the similar funding. So regardless of what the size of the previous building was, regardless of what the architectural value of the previous building was. So when we allocate similar funds to the whole urban fabric, of course, what we end up with will be the similarities, you know, similar in size, similar in many aspects. So it's important to we see this intersection, this multidisciplinary intersection, heritage, even from the beginning, you know, when that UNESCO emphasizes on the prominence of communities, people who are living there. Basically, it says that, look, is not a building, is an urban thing, is a context. And so the intersection of post-disaster management, the key principles for disaster management, which are proven to be helpful, the key challenges or the key mechanisms that through which we are implementing urban visions, and of course the heritage conservation, which the understanding that they are different levels, and at each level they are interacting each other. And the main thing, I think the very important, the understanding the linkages between urban development and heritage conservation is the first step to have this. Because if we don't have this one in normal situation, then in a post-disaster situation, we want to also touch based on creating this one. And that adds to the complexities of the whole situation. So when we think of multidisciplinary, we think that, okay, we need to be multidisciplinary. We need to take basically everything into account, not only heritage per heritage, per se, heritage for heritage per se, but heritage for city, heritage for people, heritage, the question of heritage for whom. In L'Aquila, it's very clear that it's not heritage for people, it's heritage for the future tourists. It's very, they don't say it, but it's very clear. And so basically, so when we say that, okay, multidisciplinary disaster, the principles of disaster management and the urban development, you know, the vision for the city, the vision for the neighborhood, the vision for the for that part, and how the process of urban development actually supports or hinders those multidisciplinary approaches. So basically, cities are already complex, and we are adding more complexities to it. You know, we are bringing more stakeholders to it. We are bringing more questions to answers. And yes, for each of them, for whatever expectation that we are having from heritage conservation, from disaster management, from whatever other expectations that we are having in that complex scenarios, and in my belief, not only in that complex scenario, not in post-disaster scenarios, but also in normal situation, of course, we are having expectation, the agenda that is shaped, you know, very much by socio-economic, socio-political, that level, attached with that level of context. Of course, we will have policies around those expectations. Those policies at the policy level, they might seem independent, you know, on heritage conservation. But when we translate policies to operations through projects and programs, whatever we are doing in cities, projects and programs, we don't have anything else basically. For translating policies to the field through projects and programs, for which we bring actors, for which we bring regulations, for which we bring codes, for which we bring operational policies, who does what, when, how, and we define many things. It's important that not only at the policy level, but also at the very bottom level, we see how they are or potentially can be interrelated. For example, the urban heritage at the urban fabric level, how it is related to the urban development activities in a very practical way, and it has, or the disaster management, the reconstruction operations, how they are linked in operation. And if the point is that the link is always there, even if we don't recognize it, even if we don't say it in the beginning, or we don't examine it, it will be there. So what it says here basically is, just want to come back to this. So the recognition of that multidisciplinary thing basically says that there is no best solution. There is no ideal solution. There is no ideal solution for heritage conservation in a way that makes everyone happy. It says that it's multiple, there is no one solution fits all. There are always, whatever we do, there are always challenges. Whatever approach we take, there are always challenges that should be dealt with. And the point is that, okay, what is the bigger vision? And how that bigger vision is translated to policies, and from policies to the projects, and how that translation can take into account the interconnections between different disciplines. So maybe not for monuments or for, I think in whatever level of dealing with heritage, we need to examine our projects and programs from the very objective oriented actually perspective, that, you know, examining it from how the formulation, how the organizational architecture of the program can bring all those stakeholders in the system. If they're being or they're not being contribute to the expectations, to the strategic objectives that we have. If we are bringing people in, how it is translated translated in that organizational architecture. And I'm sure that the complexities of all layers of dealing with heritage, you know, will be discussed during these workshops. And I think especially for the urban fabric on housing and commercial and, you know, the mass urban, the mass of the city, it's important to have it. And of course, for each of them, and they can be, so basically, I think that multidisciplinary examination should not only be about what to achieve, but it is about how to achieve it. And this how, this is the organizational architecture, there are lots of elements. So whatever approach we take based on the vision, we need to check if the organizational architecture fits for that purpose, if it's consistent, if it's strategic, or it is just, you know, just heritage for heritage per se. So basically, this is the famous one. If the elephant in the dark room, if each of us, if each of our disciplinary, you know, heritage people, disaster management people, municipalities, if we come and have our say on expectations for each project and program from the beginning, and help to formulate that with the realistic expectations of what can be achieved or not, I think we may go to somewhere better. But thank you very much. I talked a lot, Marvin. I'm sorry, but yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to basically any question, any discussion, because it's just the sharing my observations and my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and actually for your very interesting presentation and giving the concrete actually examples and somehow raising different challenges. Actually was, I'm sure that was very interesting and very somehow linked to the different dilemma we have in post-disaster reconstruction, especially in actually historic cities when you are dealing with different monuments, different how to say heritage and non-heritage is not really a correct actually word, but somehow this approach actually is also causing some problems, that you have this actually instead of somehow an integrated approach that actually you mentioned, and that might not be for sure kind of ideal solution, but however somehow to go through some feasible, or how to say, the most, I would say, appropriate solution for different cases. Not, for example, one approach that fits all for sure. What you need to look at actually the system, you need to look at the social background aspects, the institutional aspect actually, to see what actually could be relevant for different cases for sure. So I think we can have a very short discussion here based on your presentation, and the last 20 minutes will be dedicated to the question from participants. I would say, first of all, actually, because actually I also worked in BAM, and for some different cases, for example, one of the challenges that I've always realized in different post-disaster reconstruction was in terms of how to go through the dilemma of speed of actually reconstruction. For example, on one part, usually you have the pressure from social media, you have the pressure from the government and some others to speed up the reconstruction. So in this case, you need to somehow ignore some different time-consuming aspects like public participation and some others. And here, for example, in the case of Beirut, you mentioned, for example, there was one, actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was one organization in charge of reconstruction. So it makes actually the reconstruction actually easier to go through. So you are somehow ignoring the challenge, you are speeding up the reconstruction, and this is like that. So this is actually one approach. Another approach is actually to have somehow a multi-sectoral actually approach that to engage different sectors in cultural heritage, in urban planning, urban design, architecture, art history, and some others actually to go through this post-reconstruction, also to somehow engage people here. So, but the point is that in this case, you need really time. So you need really, because it's not easy actually to agree with some approach when you have actually the experts from different disciplines. So they have their own methodologies, they have their own approaches. Also, the example of elephants is not easy to deal with. Actually, they are seeing their own interests, actually. Then you have the conflict of interest. So what is actually your experience from BAM or some other cases in this regard? How do you see actually this multi-sectoral cooperation, public participation really a challenge in post-disaster reconstruction? How do you see that, or what is the different challenges actually you see here?
I think, Marvin, you said it right, but I think that, yes, in the beginning, we might feel that, yes, bringing multiple disciplines is time consuming. But if we don't, we will have more time of delays and challenges during the implementation. So basically, the time is there, needs to be there. So we need to, for example, when we develop a process of, usually there's a steering committee, for example, in case of Syria, also a steering committee, everything. It shouldn't be one discipline. It shouldn't be just architect. It should have a number of other disciplines to have their voice and their opinion, their objections, basically, to many points of that process, because it's through that we can avoid narrow-mindedness in the practice. You see, I think we shouldn't avoid. Because when we discuss and we challenge each other, when everything is on paper, it's it's easier, it's more important, it saves time and money. If we don't deal with that, it will happen anyway. We delay it, we postpone it, up until the practice. So my suggestion is that we need to, yes, the blueprint, the very tentative thing can be developed by the reconstruction manager or whoever it is in control of that. The tentative one, yes, but it needs to go to sociologists. It needs to go to representative of local community. It needs to go to structural, civil, whatever, environment. So the expense of not paying attention to these ones, the expense is greater than the benefit, basically. I think we shouldn't, I agree with the challenge, but I think that we need to have it because it happens anyway.
Thank you so much. Actually, another point also, the challenge you also mentioned in terms of actually to rebuild the city in general. For example, I think that was also a challenge in different countries, not only developing countries, but also in Europe. For example, you mentioned actually after actually World War II for the reconstruction, that also you mentioned in some cases reconstruction was actually more serious or more destructive than the war itself in some cases. That was also really correct. So actually another point I'm going to also raise here is, for example, in the case of BAM, actually there was also a UNESCO, actually somehow it was not only UNESCO, but different experts from UNESCO, ICOMOS, also from different experts from Iran in terms like for preparing the BAM declaration. And actually some points actually mentioned in terms of the BAM declaration for reconstruction was to build actually the city like as it was before, for example, to have those traditional actually reconstruction techniques, this earthen actually architecture, earthen buildings that one can see actually everything, for example, and somehow to remind them, for example, if you have some tourists, it can remind actually somehow appears like how it was before, So that was not only for some monuments, as I've actually read the declaration, was mainly for the whole city, something like that. So that was actually one of the approaches, was somehow really stressed in terms of reconstruction. However, there are also some other investigations, actually some interview, for example, with people. So the people, a lot of people actually, they were saying that, okay, now we need somehow a new house, which we can say, okay, if we have the earthquake, for example, in the next 100 years, then we say, okay, this is in terms of, for example, different building codes or different aspects related to resistance to earthquake. We can say, okay, this is going to be actually safe, at least, for example, by 6 magnitude or like 6.5 magnitude, something like that, for example. So it's not going to be very expensive, actually, like critical actually infrastructure, but at least should be like that. So in terms of resilience, I would say they were wishing somehow the modern buildings. A lot of people also, and I think they are right. This is the first things they're actually coming to their mind is safety, for future, because there was a lot of psychological aspect actually at that time for them, and they lost a lot of things. So it was not easy actually to think about only somehow, how to say, traditional construction. However, in terms of, for example, some monuments, or for example, in terms of BAM Citadel or some other monuments that actually no one was really living there. Also, the heritage stuff actually were there for sure. This is very important. Also, it's not only about the actually community, but we have to also think about the staff working in different actually monuments. It's also for sure very important in terms of their safety. But this is in general different. So how were some other actually also seen some other articles in terms of reconstruction of the BAM, like those engaged in emergency, actually civil protection, for example, those were saying, okay, there were a lot of actually narrow streets, very difficult for emergency evacuation. So you need to widen the streets. So it's again, so you cannot have all the layouts in the city. You cannot have really those old fabric in the city. You cannot rebuild that if you want to increase actually the resilience, disaster resilience in the city, if you want to meet the people actually needs for the future. So again, this is another challenge that you also actually touched in your presentation. What do you think in this actually? Because I know you also mentioned this is a challenge. There is no really actually one solution for that. But
there's no really one solution for
yeah,
that. Yes, I think the main challenge, I've worked in BAM. I worked in reconstruction of BAM, so I'm talking about as a practitioner, and I spent 11 years, so yes, people, the very main challenge in BAM, which I also touched on that, was that the BAM case became an opportunity to deal with the developmental shortfalls about heritage maintenance in normal situation. So basically, the challenge was that there was nothing beforehand. Even the documentation of historic buildings happened after the earthquake. Nothing was there. So imagine the reconstruction wanted to capture everything. So not only to rebuild, but also to compensate all the shortfalls, documentations, guidelines, everything and everything. Of course, it became too much. It became too much to handle. If BAM had urban development plans, for example, just for the city center, with regard to the heritage conservation system, maintenance system, I saw, there's a town in Hoi An in Vietnam. They very beautifully, they integrated heritage maintenance for small scale buildings with the urban development, and if it was there, so many questions about, shall we narrow, shall we keep the roads narrow or widen it, or cut the trees, or yes, of course, I remember the lady wanted to have an open plan kitchen. And who I am as an architect, who are we as the experts to tell people how you should live your life? For them is an ambitious is kind of development. If we had something in place beforehand, many of the challenges we didn't face. So basically the integration of urban development and heritage maintenance for the fabric. I think that will be, yeah.
Thank you. I think you're talking about actually what we have in terms of documentation, also the institutional aspect, and actually this is really in general the infrastructure we have, private, public, and this is really true actually, and that's why really there is a stress always on somehow investing before the disaster actually, instead of actually doing everything after that. But this is really difficult also to somehow convince in some cases actually the government or some authorities really to invest actually in the pre-disaster, because in some cases this is not tangible for them. They cannot really actually touch it, and in some cases there is no, maybe the priorities for actually investment are different. This is true. Yeah.
I wanted to link your comment with a question from Fatima about valuing practical method, valuing urban heritage. It's not something that I've been involved, but I've been working with a researcher on another research that he actually was working on, that is in Philippines. So they have created a very big heritage mapping across the country. So, and they have different groups in cities across Philippines to talk with the communities and gather both tangible and in the information about both tangible and intangible. I think, the challenge of documentation, if we see it, they are doing it as a very, it is top down. So it is introduced by the government, actually. It is introduced by the government. But why not? I think this is something that even can be top down, bottom up. So can be done by NGO at a smaller scale for a neighborhood or a city, or this documentation, as Marvin said.
So there is actually, if you have a question, actually raise your hand, as already also mentioned it actually by Fazan before. So I think we have the first question by Solma. Solma, please.
Thank you both for the interesting lecture and the short discussion. I have like two short comments for both of you. Maybe if, I would appreciate if you could reflect on them. First is the speed of the projects. Sometimes it is a pressure to finish everything very early, and then you have to ignore the details of conservation, which is, for example, the details that are very important for conservation experts, the documentation, the like credibility of the interventions, and sometimes, and so I know projects in Tehran, for example, you have a pressure from some of the involved stakeholders to make the project even longer. Because, I mean, when we are talking about a project, there are people who are involved in the project, they have positions, they are using a kind of fund, public fund together. They are, so they need jobs, basically. So a project means jobs for many people who work in these projects. And sometimes the projects tend to be longer because of like financial issues or financial interests of certain groups. And I don't know if you have seen similar cases in your professional or research experiences. I'm asking both of you. This is first. The second comment is about the mod structure for the like the vaster urban fabric, residential fabric in BAM. As far as I know, the base of World Heritage site of BAM, they cooperated with the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of that time, I think, or for integrating modest structures in the building codes in Iran. So and approving the regulation of how to build like earthquake resistant residential buildings or traditional mud buildings in Iran. But I haven't seen any outcome of those negotiations. So we don't have the code yet. And it is, I think, for about 8 years ago. I don't know. But why do you think we end up with these long negotiations? We have, I don't know if yes, one of the participants came from Yaz. I think he's gone now, but he was the director of the like World Heritage City of Yaz. Yes, he's Mr. Abbasi. He's in the room. And I think they are also involved in that question of building very resistant residential buildings that are like mud structures. But why doesn't it happen? Because the intention is there from the experts, from the civil engineers and from the conservation experts, but we don't have any outcomes.
So the first question you need to ask BHRC, Building and Housing Research Center, which is responsible for this. But usually what happens, you know, when a disaster happens, is a momentum for institutional improvements. And even the codes 2800, it's after the Manjil earthquake. So we owe many of the institutional improvements to basically to the momentum after disasters. I don't know what happened, but I know that one of the issues that, you know, the difference between the envisioned typologies and the built result was the lack of such codes, basically. There was the lack of such codes. So very, you know, our system is very, in Iran, I mean, it's the planning and construction system is very bureaucratic and it's very established. So I think any change may take long. I don't know, to be honest. I have no, but I think even having the discussion, I think is good. So using the momentum to improve things is good. I think we need to ask BHRC, basically, what happened. With regard to speed, yes, even for the case of BAM, to be honest, those envisioned beautiful typologies, they didn't take speed into account, consultants. They didn't take available fund into account. So it was ideal typology. You know, if we bring in the very important factors, it should be more, it should be simple, more simpler, basically. But many benefit from the lengthy, yes, the lengthy project. We know, maybe the way that the contracts are defined, because if you get a percentage, you know, if a consultancy company gets a percentage of the expenses, of course, the more expensive, the more income. So maybe the way we look at how to bring timing into the equation, maybe we need to rethink of that as well.
Thank you. I would also add actually to Farnaz that I think in terms of the speed also, yeah, as you mentioned and also Farnaz mentioned, so this is true for sure. There are different factors involved here. Actually, this is not only one, how to say, the multi-criteria aspect here. Actually, you can see, and then I think depends on actually how the authorities actually, how they see actually as a benefit here, or how different sectors involved are somehow strong here to somehow say their voice. But I would say in terms of the building code, yes, I also actually, I was not really directly involved like Farnaz there, but I also read that there was actually some different suggestions to actually, before BAM also there were actually suggestions to include actually the mod layer related actually codes. But the point is that we have already the masonry actually structures involved there, but the point is that in terms of mud layers or mud, so this is actually sun-dried bricks, so this is not really, it's different actually materials, like we talk about the mud or some different example. If you go to Latin America, they have really a classification of these kind of layers. If you check Getty conservation actually publications from Getty Institute, they already studied the mud layer a lot, and they have also some, I think, kind of, I would say, building codes for the construction. But the point is that in terms of, so I don't know what happened in the end. I don't know, first of all, but I know the in BAM was not only problem with actually the building code. There was actually a lot of problem with implementation. This is something that both actually heritage experts and also those engineers actually involved, they realized that. So there were a lot of buildings based on the modern materials like concrete and the steel and some others. Actually, a lot of them collapsed because of the earthquake BAM. So it was not because of the modern material or something, there was implementation. So they haven't really implemented based on the building codes. So that was actually one of the most important aspects in BAM. Also, I remember there was actually some investigations in terms of different traditional buildings in BAM, that some people, they mentioned that in some cases, the historic actually buildings were somehow resistant, more resistant than the modern buildings. So that was not really comparing the historic and modern material, but this is all in terms of implementation. You know, how you are implementing, because it's also expensive, because if you are going to really implementing, following the building code, so you should have actually different engineers involved, and this means that the people should afford actually this for housing activities. And in terms of like different aspect of actually speed, you also mentioned, I would also shortly going to mention that, for example, I know for the case of BAM Citadel, they've done a lot. Because as also Farnos mentioned, that was a UNESCO, was actually the BAM and cultural landscape was the whole World Heritage, but really, to be honest, that was mainly the BAM Citadel. So a lot of observation from actually within Iran, from different authorities involved, also from UNESCO experts, especially I think in the first 10 years. So they've done a lot in terms of documentation. I know in a lot of different aspects, like seismology, in terms of conservation, in terms of restoration, resistance. They've done a lot, but I'm not 100% sure, but I suppose that was mainly focused on the BAM Citadel.
Citadel, and that is a project, you know,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
no local
Exactly.
people are participating.
It's
so
completely isolated.
Exactly. So it's a project, not a program.
No. It's not linked to the city at all.
Not linked to the city.
Only isolated city, exactly.
Yeah. And still it does have its own complexities. Still it does, you know, the recruiting mechanism, how you bring other people. I just noticed that Arpita have a question. Good stage. What, in your opinion, would be a good stage in a project to engage public participation to minimize complexities, but also to involve the local understanding of heritage? I think it's the very, it depends. If it's top down, if the project is defined by the government, or if it's a bottom up, or it's run by an NGO, or it's a community initiative. But I think from the beginning, if we can have, you know, this, we can have stories of the local community about their neighborhood, about their city. If we just listen to them and see that what they see, it's their heritage, what they value. And people like to talk about good old days. And I think that is the very beginning, and to get people's input about what they think about their environment. So I don't know what, Marvin, what you think?
Actually, I was going to actually go through the next question, because there was if you agree, I don't know.
Yeah,
just
okay.
Meet Maximiliano, if I'm not mistaken, was actually the next question here.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I found it very interesting. I'm Maximiliano. I'm from Latin America. And now that you were discussing about the reconstruction or how to deal with this implementation of projects for reconstruction regarding the fabric overall, like meaning not the monuments, but like these housing projects, like what came into my mind was that like in Latin America, or like I'm from Guatemala, so we have earthquakes very often, very, very often. And these constructions made of mud or adobe, how it's called there, are very fragile, right? Like they can be damaged very easily. But what I have noticed is that it's not only that it's more expensive, but also the know-how is lost. Like architecture schools in Latin America, or like at least in Guatemala, they are like mostly focused on concrete. So when people want to repair their houses after damages, like these historical buildings, it's quite often very hard because the materials are not available, and also the know-how is not there anymore. Like people now just know how to work with concrete, but not with those old materials. So I was wondering if it might be also a factor, like in the cases that you presented. I mean, for why people decide to build differently, because it's cheaper, easier. And thank you.
In the cases that I worked on, I haven't basically we haven't came across to this, but I know that this is a case in many countries, that the local knowledge, the know-how is getting lost. I know that, and this is basically we are having a project now. We are working on intangible heritage, and intangible heritage in post-disaster recovery and resilience. And the know-how is intangible heritage, that how it can help people. But in my practice work, I haven't come across to that, to be honest. But in a research that we are working on, and yes, in Tunis. So our case studies are Tunis and Philippines, Tunis and Nepal. That how, because of the how basically tangible and intangible, when we don't, when there is no center for education anymore, when the master trainer is going somewhere else, how it affects the shortage of knowledge production and communication for those kind of skills. But in my professional, my own practical experience, I didn't come across to that, basically. Maybe because it didn't reach to that stage,
Just also adding very shortly here, also in terms of, I think, again, like the very kind of monuments that also Fanos also mentioned, I think this is somehow you need to separate it, because therefore for the monuments you have a lot of experts, and usually there are actually some people available actually for that kind of conservation, but for the city itself, for example, for the houses, the normal houses and some others. For example, one of the factors I also realized in the case of actually BAM in 2003 was actually the government was only giving loan to those people who are applying the modern materials and modern conservation techniques. So if you are going to use the loan, which is somehow the only way after actually disaster, this is the only opportunity you have, because you lost a lot of things. You have to apply actually not in this case, actually the people had to apply. I'm not going to say it in general, but at least in this case, I know they had to apply the modern techniques and modern materials. So no way.
And that's why I say that we need to examine it from multiple perspectives and things, because intangible decisions have tangible consequences. So basically, and I think if we go back, the government provides funds for just modern materials. If we can also link it with what Solmaz was saying, the lack of codes, you know, to make sure that there will be earthquake resistance again in the future. So basically, in my view, the government wanted to make sure of safe construction. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We're going out of time, but I wanted to make like a very short comment. Yes, when we are talking about government, at that time, the heritage organizations in the government were talking about this code, the necessity of this code, and the other like ministries were imposing those existing rules and the parliament. So there is also a large field of complexity in the government. The government sometimes, I mean, different parts of governments work against each other. Yeah.
A very good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. If we don't have further questions, I would suggest that we could close the meetings. I would like to thank you, Fanos, and thank you, Marvin. It was a very multi-layered discussion, and we could go on and like open all these like points of complexity and like dig in those topics for finding out what are the informal because there are very like lots of informal factors in play when we are talking about these. They are not only the codes and regulations, they are how people would like to act, and also the established informal culture in the institutions and in the organizations, that things tend to be done in certain ways, but there are really unwritten rules, and which makes everything really local, because the unwritten rules of organizations and local societies are really local issues. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank you.
attending and for your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure that the other parts of your workshop, your very interesting workshops series, will touch on different scales of these complexities, and looking forward to that.
Thank you.
I also really enjoyed the session. Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.